Me's Search for Beauty by Kira. Author's dedication. For Brittany, love yourself first and best. Illustrator's dedication. To all the people who use ugly words as weapons. True beauty comes from the heart. As all good people know, there was a time and place where homage to one's ancestors was an important part of their everyday life. No matter which god or goddess one served, every home kept an altar in honor to family members who had left their living bodies to reside in the realms beyond. Unlike some societies which gave little thought or honor to their ancestors, these people did not say one had died when they left their living bodies. It was said instead that the deceased had gone to live in the realms beyond. No matter how humble or meager, the very first item to be placed within a new home was always the ancestor's altar. The more elaborate the home, the more decorative, complex, or expensive the altar would be. It was well known that the more one spent on one's ancestor's altar, the more likely one would experience abundance, wealth, and treasure. Indeed, throughout the land there were many whose altars were more expensive or more decorative than the homes in which the altars were housed. Altars of alabaster, marble, mahogany, or even gold were found in humble homes made of wattle and daub. Even those who wandered the streets or countryside without a roof over their heads carried a special satchel with them, with bits and pieces of sacred stones, locks of hair, or dried flower petals to remind them of those who had lived before them. Beggars were known to carry elaborate scrolls written with expensive ink commemorating the names of the men and women who had populated their families, stretching back through the centuries. Children sometimes had no shoes, but the altars in their homes were adorned with jade, diamonds, or rubies. Those who failed to honor their ancestors in like fashion were often shunned, sometimes even cast out of their village by angry neighbors. Tradition had long demanded each household would make sacrifices in order to honor ancestors of both parents. How else would their souls evolve into pure light so that they would be worthy of acceptance into the golden realm of light? All good people knew the realm of the living existed only so that honor and homage might be paid to their ancestors before them. The ancestors depended upon the living to sing their praises, to recite their names and their deeds, or their souls would never reach the golden realm of light. And so did the cycle of honor repeat and perpetuate itself. If a man would wish for his children and their children after them to sing his own praises and recite his name once he'd gone to live in the realms beyond, then he would need to set a good example by instilling the tradition within his sons and daughters. The same held true for women. Each man and woman led by example so that they too would one day reach the golden realm of light. All good people knew the realms beyond were filled with tests and trials and sometimes even torture, especially for those who had failed to teach their children to revere and honor their ancestors. Woe to they who failed to carry on the proper traditions, for they would never reach the golden realm of light. Woe to them, for they would live for eternity in the realms beyond. Woe to them, for they would never earn their rest. And yet there were those who failed to honor their ancestors. Though they were few and were often harassed and accosted by neighbors and strangers alike, and most times had none who would befriend them. Suchet was such a man. He had 6 young daughters he was raising alone. His wife had gone to reside in the realms beyond while giving birth to the youngest of these. Her mother had lived with him for a time, helping to teach the girls their proper places in society and how to uphold important traditions. But she had been very old when Suchet's wife had left the realm of the living, so she, too, soon left the man and his small children behind to join her ancestors. Suchet often thought it must be easier to be an ancestor than it was to be a living man, as they would never be judged harshly for failing to meet the many demands of society, 6 hungry mouths to feed, and a small jewelry shop to operate. He'd thought of taking the girls to live with his own parents, but he'd left their home when he was a young man. They were far away, and the journey would simply be too difficult and too expensive to accomplish. All he had ever lived for had been taken from him, except the small girls. Once he'd fancied himself an adventurer and had dreamed of the places he'd visit, planning each step of his route through mountain passes and all around the shores of beautiful seas, teeming with life and exotic spices, strange people from foreign lands, and things he'd never seen before. When he was a young boy, he could hardly wait to set out. He had always done all that was asked of him by his parents and their parents and all other members of his overlarge family. He'd been a good boy. He'd been a good boy and a devoted son, caring for his parents and their needs, tending to the family temple, the ancestors' altar, and the shrines of the gods and goddesses his family had served for centuries. He had fished, he had cleaned, he had learned the trade of his father before him. He'd helped his grandmother in the gardens and his grandfather in the koi ponds. He'd helped his younger brother and sister learn to read and how to tend to the ancestor altar. And when he finally was old enough to leave the family house, he quietly folded his apron upon his father's stool in the workshop they'd shared, packed a single bag of his clothing, kissed his mother's cheek, and left out the front door, leaving his shoes behind. As all good people know, tradition demands that a young person leaving their family behind must leave their shoes as a token of their intention to return one day. Sushi had thought he would return with a wife by his side, once his taste for adventure had been satisfied. He knew no matter how many years he was away, he would always find his way home as long as his family left his shoes outside the door. If he returned home to find their shoes missing, then he would no longer be welcome in their home. Many of his dreams had been filled with terror after his wife Kayleigh had left the realm of the living, as he could no longer picture his shoes at the front door of his parents' home. He'd felt lost and adrift. Not only had his wife abandoned him to join her ancestors in the realms beyond, but he no longer felt welcome in his childhood home. Although he often wondered if his dreams were simply childish fear he should put aside, he never quite found the courage to find out the truth of the matter, and so he stayed, bereft and broken, in the home he'd shared with his lovely wife. Kayleigh had been an unexpected discovery in the third village Suchet visited after leaving the home of his parents. The one thing he had never expected in all his dreaming, scheming, and planning was to find a wife so very soon. He'd almost been dismayed to have found such a perfect wife when he was so young. He'd planned on traveling both near and far for at least 10 years before finding a wife, but he'd found her in less than one. And yet, when he thought of traveling on without her, he found it was simply impossible to pack his bags, to put his shoes on, and to plan the steps to his destination. And so, with a heart both reluctant and excited, he proposed marriage to the fascinating young woman. To his surprise, she'd been excited to join him. She'd had no intention of settling down to start a family any more than he was prepared to do. A traditional life filled with responsibilities and duties was not what she wanted any more than he had. With joyful hearts beating as one, they made plans to find a ship which would take them to the far reaches of their land, and far beyond that as well. Together, they laughed and talked and planned, and life was good. They married in the smallest possible ceremony, attended only by Kayleigh's mother and older sister. Her father refused to bless the union. He had, in fact, forbidden the marriage, claiming Kayleigh was needed at home. He and her mother were aging and would need their daughter's help until they left the realm of the living. He was angry she would dare to leave when she was needed at home. He called her selfish and claimed Suchet was heartless for taking her from his home. Kayleigh's father was insistent she and Suchet remain to help until they passed into the realms beyond, or that Suchet provide a servant to replace her. Kayleigh's mother, though, took matters into her own hands. It was, she told them, easy to see they were truly meant for each other, and so she bid them to be wed and be gone, and to never return as long as her husband remained in the realm of the living. Immediately following the ceremony, they set out across a small mountain, fully provisioned, fully prepared. It took them 2 months to cross the plains and the smallest of the mountains on their way to the sea, and once they arrived at the port city near the sea, they were even happier together than when they'd set out. Kayleigh had broken one finger on her left hand, and Suchet had suffered a deep cut on his right leg, but they were whole and hale, and eager to find just the right ship to take them far, far away. But the plans the two of them had made, like so many before them, were laughed upon by the gods. By the time they'd arrived at the port city, Kayleigh was carrying the first of their daughters. Even this fact may not have altered their plans, for they were young and in love, and this combination often leads to decisions which could easily be called foolhardy. Though bitterly disappointed, it was, in the end, Suchet who was the one to insist they look for work in the port city, instead of setting out on the next leg of their journey. Kayleigh argued heatedly against the delay, pointing out that millions of women before her had carried babies while going about their lives, some even as soldiers or sailors or into dangerous situations much worse than theirs was likely to be. But Suchet was adamant they remain. His own mother had delivered a stillborn child when he'd been a young boy, and the sight of the dead baby had left an indelible impression on him. No matter how unreasonable his fears, no matter Kayleigh's desires in the matter, Suchet would not be budged. So did the young couple settle down, leaving behind their dreams of adventure and excitement. Recognizing they found themselves in a deeply traditional area of the land, they set about making themselves as inconspicuous as possible. They'd had no intentions of staying any longer than they needed, after all. Once the child was born, they would set out again for another place, a smaller town perhaps, where they would be free to be unconventional and lead lives of merriment and color. The port city, much to their dismay, was drab and quiet. Despite the many ships which filled its harbor and the foreign people who came and went with the tides, the people who lived among the docks and wharfs and shores and shops were quiet, and they intended for their lives to be carried out in a neat and orderly fashion. Certain holy days were observed throughout the year with solemn dignity and respect. Parties, loud noises, and even shouting were frowned upon. The elders of the city made sure all stayed quiet and orderly. If a ship's captain failed to keep his crew to the standard set by the elders, he quickly found his cargo unwanted, or sometimes he even discovered his ship set mysteriously on fire in the middle of the night. The port city was not at all where Suchet and Kayleigh wanted to stay for any length of time. Still, they each found satisfactory employment. He as an apprentice to a prosperous goldsmith who was impressed with Suchet's experiences at his father's side with gems and precious stones. Kayleigh as a fish cutter on the docks. At first, they shared a room with 6 other people in a travel house, conserving their money until they could find a place they might call their own. It was far from perfect, and nothing at all as they'd pictured. Certainly nothing they would have envisioned as part of their adventurous life together. While the room was large enough to accommodate them and their many roommates, they found it difficult to be in such close quarters with so many people after the freedom of being completely alone for the 2 months during their travel to the city. There was another couple just their same age, but they quarreled ceaselessly, ending each night when one or the other of them left, often slamming the door. In the morning they would be found cuddled together in bed and in good spirits, always giving rise to the hope they would simply cease their arguments. 2 women, just a little older than they were, shared another bed. Suchet thought they might be sisters, but Kayleigh told him they were lovers. A man Suchet thought might have once been a monk slept on the floor and kept to himself, nodding cheerfully but never speaking with them. The worst of their companions was the old man who warned each of them not to touch his things or to sleep on his bed. He sat on the front porch, rocking back and forth, and reeked of dirty clothes and alcohol. The smell of him made Kayleigh's morning sickness almost unbearable. And so when Suchet's employer, Mr. Bossu, offered them a room in his own home, they quickly accepted. They found, however, Mr. Bossu and his family were among the most traditional people they'd ever encountered, and were likely to be spending time each morning and each evening on their knees in prayer, reciting their ancestors' names. While each of them had always carried with him a token of their family heritage, she, a snail shell once found along a river near the home of her great-great-great-grandmother, and he, a strip of leather his great-great-grandfather had given as a boy from his own. Nope. Well, each of them had always carried with him a token of their family heritage. She, a snail's shell once found along a river near the home of her great-great-great-grandmother, and he, a strip of leather his great-great-grandfather had been given as a boy from his own great-great-grandfather. They realized neither of them knew more than 7 or 8 generations of names, nor had they been reciting those names since they left the village where Kayleigh lived. Still, a safe place to live in a room of their own was not something to be turned down. As in so many places, there were more people than there were places to live or jobs to be had, and so they adapted. They took to their knees with the family of Mr. Bossu each morning before breaking their fast, and each evening after dinner. Each morning Kayleigh went to the docks, and Suchet went with Mr. Bossu to his shop in the heart of the city. Each night they returned to Mr. Bossu's home and slept peacefully together in their own room. And then it happened. At long last, Kayleigh gave birth to a daughter. Suchet was overwhelmed and delighted. Kayleigh had asked if he would choose a name if they had a daughter. He thought to name the girl after her mother, perhaps, or even one of their ancestors they'd been invoking each day and night for many months. They'd started discussing the names and the people behind the names, unable to quench their curiosity of what kind of people their ancestors had been. With small bits and pieces they remembered about those who lived in the realms beyond, they had shared with Mr. Bossu and his family. But when he started sharing rich stories and histories, charming anecdotes about his own ancestors, they'd felt compelled to make up stories of their own. They'd felt ashamed for not knowing more, as they were sure Mr. Bossu had intended, and even felt worse when they first started creating stories. But since it seemed to feel less bad to make up stories than to admit they had none to tell, that's what they did. They were surprised then when they each became genuinely curious as to what their ancestors had really been like. Still, there were those among the names that they did recall, which Susei thought he might be able to name his own daughter. But before Susei could decide on a name, Mr. Bossu's wife, Azuma, told him he should name the girl G. Although Azuma had always been kind to him and Kaylee, Susei wasn't pleased with her interference. Why would he want to name the child Honor? It seemed far too traditional to him, and he felt it was terribly disrespectful of the woman to put her nose into his personal business. Why would she care what name the child carried? The girl wasn't of her own family after all. When he balked, Azuma laid a hand on his arm. She had never touched him before, and suggested he spend some time praying at his ancestors' altar before making a decision. And so that night, after he had made sure Kaylee and their daughter was sleeping soundly, he went out into the neatly tended yard with its orderly stones, past the quietly tinkling fountain, and into the family temple where the ancestor altars were housed. He walked respectfully past the altar Mr. Bossu and his family had built, with its gleaming surfaces of gold and granite, with statues of mighty dragons and charging horses, adorned with cleverly wrought chips of jade, sapphires, and even diamonds, to the one he and Kaylee had erected near the northwest corner of the temple. It was a small wooden table with a ragged but clean kneeling cloth laid before it. There were shells and stones and flowers there, along with a small piece of jewelry he'd patched together from the scraps where he worked. There was the snail shell Kaylee had carried from her home, next to the scrap of leather he'd always carried with him. Everything was clean and in order, but provided him with no inspiration or instruction. He wondered exactly what it was that Azuma thought he should do. He took off his shoes, lit a candle, and then touched it to a cone of incense. The smell of jasmine filled his senses, and he thought perhaps that was a name he would use for his new daughter. Jasmine. In the language of his people, she would be called Matsurika. But he knew of no ancestors of either of the families which were called by that name, so was unsure if the name would suit. He liked the name himself quite well, and the more he allowed the name to roll off his tongue, the more he found he liked it even better. It was a beautiful name. Still he hesitated, almost afraid to decide. While he wasn't pleased with Azuma's interference, he feared her reprisal if he was bold enough to completely ignore her advice. And then he felt angry for feeling afraid of Azuma's reprisal. Why would she be so outrageous as to suggest he name their new daughter Honor? Fear, however, won out over his anger. He had a family to think of now. He couldn't afford to be cavalier or even indulgent in his own emotions. And so he emptied his mind, knelt before the ancestors' altar, and prayed. He didn't really know how to pray any longer, though, and so it came hard to him. Since he'd left his family's home, he'd only recited the names of his ancestors, both remembered and made up. He told of deeds he knew and then created stories which he'd hoped were true, but he'd never truly prayed to the gods, goddesses, local spirits, house spirits, or ancestors since he'd been a small child. This night, though, was so much dependent upon his decision, he opened his heart and asked for guidance. Nor did he have long to wait. Almost as soon as he bowed his head to the floor, he heard a voice. Nor was it a whisper of a voice. It was a loud, booming voice. In fact, Susei thought he might understand what the phrase, "he jumped out of his skin," meant. He felt chill bumps standing out on his arms, and the back of his neck tingled when the voice rang out. "At long last!" It was a man's voice, and sounded eerily like his father. "We've been waiting for you." Susei quickly lifted his head, looking around. He saw no one. He was alone. But he could feel there was someone in the temple with him. There was no doubt whatsoever. He was not alone. Never in his wildest imagination did he ever think an ancestor would truly talk to him. He'd long thought simply holding the memories of those who lived in the realms beyond fresh in his mind would somehow help them. He'd never really quite understood how, nor had he tried to understand how his own actions might influence the spirits of his ancestors who were no longer among the living. He took it on faith that what his own parents had taught him was the truth, and that was the end of it. If he'd really taken the time to wonder just how it was he thought the ancestors might help him with the decision he needed to make for his daughter's name, he probably would have said that he thought quiet reflection would bring him inspiration. He certainly had not thought to hear a real voice ringing out in the temple, and not a loud one. Susei knew he should say something, but he was too stunned to reply, to move, to even think, so he simply knelt there on the ragged rug in front of the ancestors' altar he and Kaylee had constructed together, feeling altogether inadequate. Nothing was right. Everything was wrong. He felt shame for the lack of prayers he'd given, for the lack of homage and honor. He felt small and insignificant and somehow soiled. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn for more than a day, the work clothes he'd had on when the young boy Azuma had sent to tell him Kaylee was in labor had burst into the shop. He hadn't showered or changed or even approached the altar with much respect, certainly not with any kind of true expectations of receiving help, and the altar itself. He cringed, feeling his cheeks warm with a blush of embarrassment. He felt for the lack of finery or expense he provided in honor of those who had need of his help in the realms beyond. For the first time in the whole of his life, he felt as though he really should have been paying attention to the things his parents had taught him. He should have been helping to ease the passage of his grandparents and aunts and uncles and other relatives from the realms beyond into the golden realm of light. Suchet felt utterly ashamed and even frightened. What if this ancestor had been dispatched to make him atone for his lack of honor and homage? I am humbly sorry for having failed you, ancestor, was the best Suchet could imagine. After all, what do one say to someone who is dead and lived in the realms beyond? Nonsense! Boomed the voice. Your lack of faith has provided me with the opportunity to earn my own way to the golden realm of light. Suchet was relieved and at the same time immediately skeptical. He searched the shadows of the temple, beginning to wonder if the voice was nothing more than a joke of some kind. He couldn't imagine how such a thing might be possible, but he was willing to entertain the thought that the voice he was hearing was not truly from the realms beyond. Since it seemed his own death wasn't going to be forthcoming, he sat up a little straighter. But I thought the realms beyond were terrible, he protested. Why would you be glad for my lack of faith? But they are terrible, the voice insisted. They are terrible beyond your ability to understand, and so I welcome your lack of obedience and faith. If you had been honorable and done as your mother and father and their parents before them had done, then I would not have been offered this unique opportunity to earn my way into the golden realm of light. Who are you? Suchet asked, his eyes narrowing. How do I know you're not a demon or some evil spirit come to claim my soul? He'd heard terrible tales of demons jealously guarding the realms beyond, so that no living man or woman could pass through unless they were well and truly dead. All good people knew those who had died, but were returned to the realm of the living were forever changed. Without fail, they reported they were afraid by what they'd seen and not the least comforted. Those who would speak of the ordeal would talk about a terribly bright light, too bright and too hot to stand. Most said they'd felt compelled to throw themselves into the light as if they were nothing more than a human moth, drawn without rhyme or reason towards their own destruction. Kayleigh had told him she'd heard monks and priestesses explain that until one was truly ready for death, the light was a terrible force, one which felt all wrong and terrifying, but that once the soul's journey into the realm of the living was complete, then the light was comforting and welcoming. She said she'd been taught that the spirits who guard the gateway between the realm of the living and the realms beyond appeared as frightening demons until the soul's purpose in the realm of the living was completed. Then the demons appeared as friendly spirits. Suchet had always wondered if the children who had left the realm of the living encountered frightening demons or friendly spirits. It seemed to him that no soul could possibly have completed its purpose as a mere child. I am called Shinpu, and there are others with me, Suchet, son of Peisan, and Kanji. Each of us has a specific task to fulfill if we are to ascend to the golden realm of light. Listen closely, though, as my time here is limited and I shall not return. You will have 5 daughters and no sons, no more and no less. You shall name your daughters for the 5 virtues all good people hold dear. Ji shall be your firstborn in honor of the promise you make this night to do as you are bid. Your second daughter shall be named Rei, for the respect you owe to the mothers, fathers, daughters, sons, and generations of men and women who have lived and died before you. Your third daughter you shall name Jen, for the compassion you and Kayleigh will need between the 2 of you to care for this child. Your 4th daughter shall be named Ko, as you shall receive the justice you will receive for your obedience. And your last child, another girl, you shall name Chu, if you wish to have your own transition from the realms beyond to the golden realm of light eased by her loyalty once you and Kayleigh have left the realm of the living. Honor, respect, compassion, justice, and loyalty? Suchet asked, his eyebrows raising into his hairline in astonishment. What kind of names are those? Why must I do this? I have so many questions. You admit you have failed in your faith and in honoring your ancestors. Here then is your chance to make amends and to create a better world for you and those around you. Obey and you will prosper and have treasure beyond your imagination. Fail and you shall know misery beyond despair. I shall be Guy's guide. Each of your children shall have a guide of her own. We will reveal ourselves to each child as we see fit. At the spirit's last word, he felt the presence of Shinpu leave him. For hours he paced back and forth, then fell to his knees. He whispered, he whimpered, he called and pleaded, and even demanded, but he heard no further word from Shinpu nor any other spirit. He was sorely tempted to believe he'd simply fallen asleep and had a terrible dream, but he knew better. He was afraid, terribly afraid, but in the end he did as the spirit bid him and named his new daughter G, which all good people know is translated into the language of that land as honor. And, just as Shimpu had told him, events unfolded, providing Suche and Kaylee with 5 daughters. And prosper they did. They remained with Bosu and Azuma until their third daughter, named Jin for the virtue of compassion, was born. They were well pleased they'd been so blessed with treasure and had so prospered so generously, for they would have been hard-pressed to provide for their growing family without the riches they received. Suche's experience had continued to improve, as had his position with Mr. Bosu's shop. His work became so well known he'd been presented with offers of partnerships in other shops, with proposals for grants, and with suggestions on how to expand his client base. In short, they had all they needed and more, with no end in sight for the opportunities which might present themselves. So when it appeared Jin had been brought into the world stillborn, Suche and Kaylee despaired. They'd known to expect some kind of problem with their third daughter, and had speculated for nearly 4 years what they should expect, never being able to guess how to prepare. Would she be blind or crippled? Would she be exceptionally brilliant or mean-spirited? They had gone over every possible thing they could think of, but had certainly not considered that she might be born dead. 2, she had arrived earlier than they expected, and had turned an alarming shade of blue by the time she'd been pulled forcefully from her mother's womb with a cord firmly around her tiny neck. Still, the midwife had known what to do, and had returned the tiny speck of a girl to the realm of the living. In later years, Sushi often wondered if Jin had encountered demons during her brief visit to the gateway between the realm of the living and the realms beyond. She was often so quiet and so still you wouldn't even know she was in the same room with you unless you happened to see her. Both Sushi and Kaylee found Jin to be the most difficult of the children to understand, as she was so often lost in a world of thoughts instead of action. Even as a small child, she would prefer to sit quietly, watching the world around her instead of playing with toys or running and laughing like the rest of the children did. She wasn't unhappy or unhealthy. She just had a very small body and was unnaturally still. Nor did she speak much, but when she did, it always seemed as she was much older than her young body could explain. Compassion was a virtue for which she was named. Kaylee hoped the future would treat her kindly as an adult, since she knew it must be terribly difficult for her small daughter to understand why others may see the world differently than she did. Most simply thought their third daughter was lost in thought, unaware of her surroundings, unable or unwilling to interact with them. After her mother's death, Suche worried the small girl might never smile again. She was odd, this third daughter, but having been warned she would be different, her parents worried less than they would have otherwise done. The birth of each daughter brought about more riches and more prosperity, along with the marvel of learning each of the children had distinct personalities well suited to their odd names. G was a serious girl, concerned with all things spiritual in nature, and giving honor where it was due, often preferring to spend long quiet hours in the family's garden deep in meditation, or communing with the gods and goddesses of ancient faiths. Ray, named for the virtue of respect, was quite the opposite, always exploring with wide-eyed excitement. She was eager to learn how and why everything worked and how to take things apart. She was joyful and excitable in each activity and found it impossible to sit still. It was important, she would often say, to find out how everything worked, so you'd understand how everything connected together. After the constant motion of Ray, the addition of small, quiet Jin was almost jarring. Kaylee protested it simply wasn't natural for a small child to sit so very still for such long periods of time. Still, her hearing, eyesight, and all limbs were in working order, and her development was perfectly as it should be. So Sushi suggested she simply allow their daughter to be who she was without the need for alarm or concern. Ko, named for the virtue of justice, was just as energetic as her second sister, but more intense. Where Ray was always taking things apart and exploring, Ko questioned philosophies and the reasonings her parents and other adults gave her for the smallest of occurrences. She was much more serious than Ray, and often argued past the point of discretion with her parents. Kaylee was delighted with her daughter's intelligence, but worried the intense focus of her intentions would make people avoid her, leaving her lonely. By the time Chu was born, Sushi and Kaylee had their own home nestled on a nice lot of land overlooking a small beach surrounded by trees, with a small river running near the southeastern corner, and everything they could ever ask for. Sushi's business was prosperous enough that he sometimes was able to refer his customers to his old employer, Mr. Bosu. Kaylee had long ago given up her work on the docks in favor of remaining home with the girls, and their ancestor altar was overflowing with precious gems and delightful gifts which would do any ancestor proud. Indeed, it was the sparkle of sapphires, rubies, diamonds, and emeralds which seemed to fascinate the daughter named for the virtue of loyalty most. She was a happy child, cheerful and kind, with little interest in much other than play. Unlike her older sister, she wasn't interested in sitting still or meditation or discovering the deeper meaning of anything at all. She and Ray often played together noisily, but where the older girl was always eager to take things apart to discover what made them work, Chu was delighted to simply play with whatever item came into her grasp. Each time a new daughter was born, Suchet returned to the ancestors' altar to pray, and each time he heard the voice of a different spirit. No matter how often he would pray, the only time he ever heard a voice was when each child was born. He kept waiting for some kind of evidence these spirits had revealed themselves to the children, but had no idea what he was looking for. He thought perhaps they would manifest themselves as the girls grew older, but for all he knew, the spirits themselves were responsible for the personalities each of them demonstrated. Maybe the girls were even the spirits of their ancestors reincarnated. It was impossible for him to know. One thing he did know, however, was just how important it was for him to teach the girls about the ancestors' altar, and he did that from the time they were each very tiny. G was 11 years old, with Chu only 3 when he found Kaylee crying one night. She was pregnant again. Neither of them understood what it might mean. Shinpu had told them they would have 5 daughters, no more and no less, and no sons. They'd planned their lives accordingly and had done everything asked of them. They were happy and were teaching their children to honor the ancestors. What had they done wrong? Together they went to the ancestors' altar to pray, but they heard no voice. Still they remained on their knees, waiting and listening. They stayed in the temple they'd built together until morning, asking to be heard, asking for answers, asking for guidance, and still they heard no voice. When the sun was shining brightly through the window, all 5 of the children came looking for them. Because these most cherished daughters had been lovingly created in accordance with divine planning, their parents shared their fears with the young girls. They hoped beyond hope that if the spirits did reside within the children, that they would share some insight with them. G told them that they had honored their word and done all that was asked. Ray told her parents they had respected their ancestors with their obedience. Jin merely came and hugged each of them, but uttered no word. Cole told them justice had been served. Chu, cheerful, bright, and curious, told them she would always recite their names and remember the deeds they'd done in honor of the ancestors. Then she began to cry. She would not be consoled, no matter the attention her family showered upon her, no matter the hugs or the promises of sweets. Kaylee held the child, rocking her gently until the crying finally slowed. Quietly, with a calm, serious reserve she had never shown before, the small girl told her family there was another spirit who lived with them now. It was a spirit of the sea. Chu brightened a bit when she told them it was a pretty spirit, but then she started crying again and wouldn't leave her mother's side. For the remainder of the pregnancy, the small girl was mournful and quiet. Sometimes they would see her moving her lips, even though she was making no sound. When Kaylee asked what she was doing, Chu told her mother she was praying. The praying and chanting and rocking seemed to help her feel better, but she was no longer the playful imp her family had come to expect. Instead, she became as serious and withdrawn as her middle sister, Jin. As the time for the new baby to arrive crept closer and closer, the little family gathered tighter together, spending time in each other's companies, playing games, taking walks, or just sitting together after meals talking quietly. Each of the girls took turns holding their mother's hands, none of them willing to spend time away from Kaylee. Never had Suchet seen his home filled with such quiet and disquiet, and still his prayers went unanswered. The day his 6th daughter was born, Suchet destroyed his family's ancestors' altar. He'd done all his ancestors had asked of him, yet he'd lost that which was most precious to him. It was as if her own life had been transferred to the child, for as the babe drew breath for the first time, Kaylee exhaled her last. Much later, he was grateful the midwife had had the presence of mind to call in help for the children and to prepare Kaylee for the funeral, as he lost all presence of mind for 3 days. For the rest of his life, he would never be able to recall what he'd done during the days immediately following the birth of his youngest daughter. Nor had he held her or even looked at her. Something deep and terrible inside of him blamed the child for causing his precious wife to leave the realm of the living. It took Suchet quite some time to even think of the child as his own, and not some demon from the realms beyond who had somehow tricked his wife into trading places with her. Time passed and the years wore on, but never again did Suchet pray, nor did he allow his children to rebuild the family's ancestors' altar. He had turned a blind eye to the bits of Kaylee's personal possessions that each collected and kept for themselves, knowing they would honor the traditions he'd taught them, even knowing he would not. He heard prayers and chants and the reciting of names from time to time, just out of his hearing, but he never made them stop. His heart broke each time he heard any of them engaged in these activities, but he kept his sadness to himself. As for his youngest daughter, he finally named her. It took nearly 2 years before he realized he only ever called her Me. Once he stopped thinking of her as a demon and really looked at her, he realized she looked more like her mother than any of her sisters did, and so he named her Beauty. Me was truly a lovely little girl, very much like any other little girl, except for the fact that she was very pretty, and the fact that she didn't get along with any of her sisters very well at all. Suchet watched as she interacted with each of them and wondered if perhaps the others blamed her for their mother's death. He approached each of them separately, making gentle inquiries, but each assured him that Me was not held responsible for Kayleigh's travel to the realms beyond. In fact, Suchet got the distinct impression that each felt a bit sorry for her, that she would never know her mother, and they made an extra effort to be nice to her because of her loss. Why then, he asked them, did it seem like they really didn't like Me so very much? None of them played with her nor welcomed her to join them unless the whole family was doing something together. Nor did he ever witness Me joining in the secret chants and prayers the girls held together in honor of their ancestors. G told him her smallest sister simply had no honor. Me cared nothing for the same things any of the others liked nor wanted to do, and was obsessed with her looks above all. Ray told her father her smallest sibling had no respect for the wishes of her sisters, nor even for herself as far as she was concerned. If Me wanted to waste all her time looking in the mirror, that was her choice, but she shouldn't expect her sisters to join her in such time-wasting pursuits. Jin told her father Me had no compassion for anyone else, that she'd seen her purposely push Chu out of the way when she wanted to peek in the mirror at herself, and that Me destroyed the prettiest clothes anyone else had with inks and dyes. Sushi already knew how Ko felt about her younger sister, when she flat out refused to have anything to do with her from the day she was born. Even when the family was gathered together, she ignored Me. When they'd asked why she treated her sister so poorly, Ko had bristled, pouting. She claimed justice wasn't served by Me's beauty, that she should have something more about her that made her a worthwhile human being. Even little Chu had trouble liking Me, which Suchet could see troubled her greatly. She was all about loyalty, and felt her sister was owed her affection and kindness for the mere fact that they were sisters. But, she whispered quietly, Me was mean and made her feel ugly because all she talked about was how pretty she was, instead of how pretty anyone else was. This kind of behavior clearly hurt Chu's feelings, and her ability to give her sister her unconditional devotion. Suchet considered everything each of his children had to say, then asked Me how she felt about her sisters. Her conclusion was they were jealous of her. She couldn't help it if she was more beautiful than any of them, or that she looked more like the mother they all loved, but who she would never meet. Their discussion ended in tears instead of as Suchet had intended. It was important to him that each of his daughters understand one of the most important things that Kayleigh had taught him, to love himself first and best. It had been a strange concept to him at first, and certainly nothing his parents had ever taught him, nor anything the society into which they'd been born had agreed with. Honoring one's ancestors so they might reach the golden realm of light was the very most important thing that every child learned. It was what each man and woman lived for and how they planned their lives and ordered each of their days. After one's ancestors, their family members were most important. Each was a part of the whole, and each individual family member must stand with and for the other members of their family, no matter how cruel or delightful those family members were. Mother and father were the joint head of the family and must be obeyed without delay. Brothers and sisters were to be taught how to behave and encouraged to help in all things together. Aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, everyone was included in the family. All others were outsiders and must earn trust and respect. Once a family member married, then their spouse was a member of the family and beyond suspicion. Once everyone else was served and satisfied, then one's own needs or desires could be considered. But this was exactly the opposite of what Kayleigh had taught him was true. Unless he loved himself first and best, she told him, then she would always be able to make him feel small, inadequate, and worthless. So would other people, but since she was the one who he loved the most, then she was the one who could hurt him the most. And so she counseled him to always love himself best, even more than he loved her. It was hard to understand at first, and even harder to put into practice, but he realized that even when he had insisted they not take the ship when she was pregnant the first time, he had been loving himself first and best. If she could have not lived with his decision for himself, then Kayleigh would have had to leave him, and he would have had to have accepted her decision. Making someone love you isn't loving them at all, she would say. How he longed for her counsel now, but wishing she was in the realm of the living wasn't going to make it true. It was up to him to help his daughters love themselves for whoever they decided they wanted to be. And so, when Me was 16 years old, he took her to see a wise woman he'd known for many years. She lived in a charming little house on the edge of the sea. Her house was built on sturdy stilts so that the tides could come and go beneath her. Many had warned him in the years while Kaylee was alive that she was evil and to stay away from her. They said she was someone to be afraid of. Of course, now many of those same people said the same thing about him, so he took no heed. He knew this woman would have the answers he sought. He'd thought many times of taking me to see Majo, but had hesitated. The woman had counseled Kaylee throughout the years, often sharing news and gossip of the surrounding neighbors. She'd always returned home smiling and in good spirits, but she'd never taken any of the girls with her during her forays to Majo's home. When Suchet had asked her why she didn't, since it seemed they were such close friends, and it seemed to him that the girls would benefit from the older woman's counsel and company, Kaylee merely shrugged, saying she didn't believe Majo cared much for children. And so Sushi had waited, even suggesting from time to time that one of the other girls might want to take their youngest sister with them to see the woman. Only once did he receive a reply from any of the girls, all of whom eventually went to see Majo after their mother left the realm of the living. G told him, "Not yet," and then would say no more. The other girls only ever shook their heads, but would tell him nothing. And so did Suchet wait until Me was 16 and no longer a child. He was determined to provide his youngest daughter with at least one connection with her mother, and there was simply no one else to whom he could turn. To his surprise, she was eager to meet the older woman. Majo met Suchet and Me at the bottom of the stairs to her house, on sand that was dry because the tide had not yet rolled in for the day. She held up one hand in greeting with a smile on her face as they made their way across the rocky shore, but dropped both her hand and her smile as they drew nearer. "Do not take off your shoes," was her greeting. This, as all good people know, was a warning that they were not welcome in her home. If she had turned her back and walked into her home, shutting the door before they reached her, then they would not have been welcome to speak with her. From her greeting, she was willing to speak with them, but would not allow them into her home. Sushi bowed, his face flushed with embarrassment. He had often visited his friend's home in the past. Why was she refusing entry now? "This child has a fatal flaw," the old woman told Suchet, looking directly into Me's eyes. "And this woman is ugly," Me sneered. At that the woman's cheek lifted in a smile. "Do you think so, child?" she asked. Suchet thought the woman looked amused and was confused. "Well, just look at you," she exclaimed. "Your hair looks like seaweed, your shoulders are slumped, your clothes are ragged, your shoes are torn, your skin is wrinkled, and your nose is far too big for your face." Sushi was mortified. How could he have so failed to teach this daughter respect, honor, and simple manners? What was wrong with her? "My friend," Majo smiled kindly at Sushi, "do not be alarmed. You have brought your daughter to the right place. Leave us now." "But," Sushi started to protest, how could he just leave her? What would Majo do to her? He was suddenly less confident of his decision to bring her here at all. He wanted to protect his beauty, to tame her, to help her to be kind as well as beautiful. He was afraid of the things Majo would say or do, but he had seen, just as the other girls had told him, that Me was mean-spirited and judgmental and vain, and he was ill-equipped to deal with such nonsense. If her mother had stayed in the realm of the living, perhaps she would have known how to mold this young woman into a responsible, loving person. Sushi's heart felt heavy and saddened as he walked away from the youngest of his daughters and out of our story, but he saw no alternatives. Once Sushi was out of sight, Majo turned herself into a mermaid. She was stunning and more beautiful than Me would have ever believed possible. Astonished, she begged the woman to show her how to become a mermaid so she too could be beautiful, but Majo refused. She told the girl until she was able to see herself as something more than beautiful, she would never reveal the secret to turning herself into a mermaid. "But being beautiful is all I am," Me complained. "It's not my fault. My oldest sister G is named for the virtue of honor, and so she is honorable. Everything she does and says must be in honor of one thing or another, but never because she wants to do a thing or because she doesn't like to do a thing. If it isn't honorable, then she will never experience it. She is utterly boring and never has an original idea of her own. Ray," Me continued, "is named for the virtue of respect, and that is her only focus in life. It is of vital importance to her that everyone is demonstrating respect with their every breath. She is pretty too, but will never look in a mirror because she has it in her head that being pretty is somehow irrelevant or disrespectful. Having fun is disrespectful. Being joyful is disrespectful. Why would I want to be like her?" Jin is compassionate and can sometimes be fun, but she worries all the time whether everything is fair. Did everyone get exactly the same amount of food or fun or sleep? Who cares? Me threw up her hands in exasperation. It never occurs to her that someone else doesn't want exactly the same thing or the same amount of everything, she will worry herself to death. And of course, there's Co. Me rolled her eyes. She seeks justice in every situation, no matter how bizarre. I think sometimes that Jin and Co. should have been twins because fairness is so important to both of them. Of course, Jin wants everyone to have the same thing because she feels bad when someone is left out. That's the only reason she ever played with me as a child, because she felt sorry for me, not because she liked me. But Co has refused to say more than a handful of words to me since I was born, because I offended her sense of justice. I should never have been born her, in her opinion, so she arrogantly looks down her nose at me, pretending I have no right to exist. She is quite comfortable in her superior attitude, because she can justify her feelings. Why would I want to be like her? And Chu? Majo asked. What about the sister who is closest to you in age? Chu was named for the virtue of loyalty, so she cannot help but be drawn to me, Mi admitted. She does her best to like me, despite the fact that she does not, but as we've gotten older, she has done her best to avoid me. She is a happy person and dislikes feeling uncomfortable in my presence, so she just avoids me. And you, my pretty, what about your faults? Majo asked, flipping her tail. I am beautiful. That is all I am and all I shall ever be. That is my one and only fault. Your fault is that you cannot see that you can be anything you wish to be. It is the same fault your sisters possess. Because they were named a thing, they have agreed that is all they are. If a parent tells their child they are stupid at every turn, the child begins to believe it is true. If instead the parent tells their child they can be anything they wish to be, then that is what they will come to believe. So my father is to blame for my faults? Mi asked, a predator's gleam in her eye. Majo shook her head, sorry this young woman would not see. No, Mi asked with a sly look crossing her face, but that is all everyone ever says to me, that I am beautiful. Everyone remarks how beautiful I am. Nobody ever says how smart or clever or how hard I work. No one ever mentions the paintings I create nor the daily chores I perform. I have been called beautiful since the day of my birth, as have many other girls. If beauty is so unimportant, then why do so many people remark on how pretty a girl is or how beautiful I am? Why, even girls remark on how handsome boys are. If beauty is so unimportant, then why does everyone see nothing but pretty or handsome? Tell me that, Mi snapped. I cannot answer for society and for all the reasons people do so many foolish things. All I can tell you is that if you refuse to understand that beauty is the least important thing about you or anyone else, then you shall always feel as though you are not good enough. You are an ugly old woman, Majo, no matter how beautiful you may look as a mermaid, Mi screeched. Then she lunged at the woman, throttling her. Majo, though, had long known this day was coming, and she was a magical being. She was a gatekeeper between the realm of the living and the realms beyond. She had neither been alive nor dead for many years. It had been her fault that Mi was born, and not the fault of Suche or Kele. They had done as their ancestors had bid them, and they had paid a heavy price. The ancestors had been greedy in their bid to get to the golden realm of light, and ignorant of the cost the girls would pay for the names they had bestowed upon them. Majo, too, had been greedy in her own bid to ascend to the light, but wasn't sorry she would finally be leaving her post as gatekeeper. 7 centuries had taken a terrible toll on her, and she was eager to move to the next phase of existence. Mi had been born because Majo had interfered, giving Kaylee a potion to drink, which would make her pregnant, and it had worked. In that potion had been a drop of her own blood, guaranteeing that Mi would one day find her way here. She needed someone to take her place as gatekeeper, and Mi would do nicely. Mi felt her body shifting and changing as the life of the old woman dwindled, and she smiled. But as she felt her legs merging into a mermaid's tail, she saw her sister standing on the beach where she lay, half in the water, half on the sand, with her hands still firmly around Majo's throat. Before she could say a word, she saw G point at her, and a strange kind of light come from her hand. In honor of the love our parents shared, you shall keep your beauty, but you shall be burdened with a crown of gold. You will never be able to remove it unless you find someone to love who loves you in return. If you do this, the gold will fall to pieces, but you will lose your beauty. Mi felt the crown as it formed on her head. The weight of it was terrible, but she was confident she would one day love and be loved, so thought nothing of it. There was nothing wrong with gold. It would do nothing but enhance her beauty. Perhaps she would even be able to melt some of it down and sell it. Then she would be both beautiful and rich, and she would be able to move far, far away from her strange family. Her father would be sad, she knew, but even he had become cold and distant lately. It would probably be better for him if she was gone, she concluded, so welcome the heavy crown of gold. It would provide her with the means to live her own life on her own terms. Ray then stepped forward, pointing at her. Again a strange kind of light came from her hand as she said, because you failed to respect our ways, and each of us as your sisters, you will always carry a mirror in your left hand, so you can see the kind of person you really are. As long as you continue to seek beauty, the mirror will remain blank. When you learn you are more than beauty, then the mirror will show your true face, and you will be free of it. Me felt her left hand stretch and twist and break and grow. She screamed with the pain of it, and her heart raced in her chest. She was frightened, not understanding what was happening to her. When the pain subsided, she was holding a mirror, but just as Ray had said, it was blank. She let go of Maja with her right hand, letting her body fall away into the incoming tide, feeling the old woman's body begin to move away from her. Me tried to stand up, but could not, as the transformation to mermaid was complete. She no longer had legs, but her shimmering tail was stunning. Beautiful, incredible. She heard Jin's quiet voice next, just before the strange light enveloped her once more. Because I have compassion for even you, you who were so mean-spirited to the rest of us, I shall give you a comb so that even though you cannot see how beautiful you are, you might still feel beautiful. I would rather give you something more useful to help you understand that beauty is nothing compared to kindness. But because you are my sister, I shall give you what is most important to you. When you realize kindness is more important than beauty, the comb will fall to pieces, but your hair will fall out and will never grow back. In moments, Me's right hand had formed into a large red comb. She felt herself start to panic. How would she eat? How would she live? What kind of life was this? The pain of the transformation was nothing compared to the fear of the unknown. What would happen to her now? Then Ko stepped forward, and she cringed inside. Ko had hated her more than the rest of her sisters did, and not for the reasons she told everyone. Me knew Ko hated her because she was the least beautiful of all the sisters. She was jealous. He was too heavy and too short, and her nose was too small on her round face. Her mouth was too large, and her feet were too. She would have a hard time finding someone to love her with the way she looked. Justice demands you be given a fair chance to make different choices, Ko said, pointing at me, and so my gift to you is the gift of flight. Now you'll be able to fly all over the world searching for someone to love, and who will love you in return. However, if you learn to love yourself first and best, no matter if anyone loves you or not, then the wings will fall to pieces and you'll be returned to your human form. Me screamed as she felt her back twist and burn. Then her skin and bones stretched, creating beautiful wings. She sobbed, not knowing what to do. She was no longer truly human. She was still beautiful, she was sure, but she would never be able to tell if she was or not, because the stupid mirror in her hand was blank. The comb in her other hand would do her absolutely no good at all. How could she cook or clean or write or paint? How would she ever be able to have a conversation with someone without the use of her hands? And though the wings were lovely and the pain subsiding, how would she fly if she had a tail? And how would she swim if she had wings? She was nothing but a freak. And still she had one more sister to go, one more gift to receive. She drew herself up from the water and the sand onto her elbows and watched as Chu came closer. Instead of pointing at her, though, the youngest knelt beside her instead. Because you are my sister, and I am loyal to all my sisters, I will give you words to help you use to remember that you are beautiful, she said. Beautiful, me screeched. Isn't that what got me into this mess in the first place? I like myself, Chu said. Then she and the others walked away. And that's the end.